It's my pleasure to welcome you all to our fourth annual The Whole Story, a Decolonial Cross-Cultural Day Institute. Thank you for those of you who are joining us in person and also virtually on Zoom. I'm Dr. Rebecca Mauser, an Associate Professor of English here at Missouri Southern State University and co-founder and co-chair of this event. When my former colleague, Jen Ferguson, approached me 5 years ago with the idea for this event, I was beyond excited. It's an event that we were hoping to expand the voices that we hear on a college campus. Our first event, which allowed for small hands-on sessions on campus pre-COVID, was a huge success, and we were able to raise over $16,000 for an endowed scholarship, the Clark and Marina Pepper Scholarship for BIPOC students of English. The move to virtual experience proved successful as well, even if a little difficult at first. And we're happy to be back in person, where through the advances of technology, we also get to keep you guys kind of best of both worlds. My co-chair, Dr. Megan Bever, Associate Professor of History and Chair of Social Sciences here at MSSU, and I both welcome you to the event today. And before introducing our featured speaker, I do want to pause and acknowledge whose lands the university occupies. I have an acknowledgement provided by the Osage Nation. We respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional ancestral lands of the Osage Nation. The process of knowing and acknowledging the land we stand on is a way of honoring and expressing gratitude for the ancestral Osage people who are on this land before us. And today, it's my pleasure to introduce the featured speaker, Jake Skeets. He received his MFA in poetry from the Institute of American Indian Arts, and his debut collection, Eyes Bottled Dark with a Mouthful of Flowers, published by Milkweed in 2019, was selected for the 2018 National Poetry Series and received the Kate Tufts Discovery Award. Jake has also won an American Book Award and the Whiting Award, and he is from the Navajo Nation and teaches at the University of Oklahoma. I spent my evening last night reading through some of his work and was struck by the richness of his imagery and the power of his voice. And since you did not come here to see me, but rather him today, I'm happy to turn it over to Jake, and hopefully you will please welcome him as well.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you all for being here today. I'm honored to have been invited to speak to you all today. I'm just going to first introduce myself in Dene, or Navajo. Yate She Matthew Jake Skeets in She, Sanajin the Shle, Skobahan Bashes Chin, Skachini Dash Che, Do Twitter Dash and what that roughly translates to is, hi, my name's Jake. I am of the Blackstreet Wood people, born for the Water's Edge people. I'm from the Navajo Nation, and I currently teach at the University of Oklahoma, as was stated. And today, I'm going to talk to you about this idea I've been sort of fumbling through and really wondering out loud about, this idea of language of possibility, that sort of keeps sort of recurring in my sort of research and this idea of decolonization and this idea of futurity, specifically indigenous futurity. So primarily today, I'm going to be talking to you in sort of like in an academic sense that really sort of explores native texts, native literature, native arts. And at the end, I'll end with one of my poems that sort of really sort of is trying to capture what I'm trying to think about or think through. So today's talk is titled The Language of Possibility, Native Textures and Futurity. And before I begin, I just briefly want to talk about the knowledge that's sort of talked through here and discussed and explored as not really mine. I really think that a lot of the ideas I'm proposing and working through are only possible because of people like my parents and other scholars that I mentioned in the talk, but also other poets, specifically poets like Sherwin Bitsui, Orlando White, Manny Lowly, and other Diné writers like Bojan Lewis and Danielle Geller. Because of time, I couldn't sort of venture into all the texts that I wanted to really explore. But I wanted to also give sort of a range. And so I'm not solely focused on Diné literature or Navajo literature. I sort of take a wider survey of Native literature in general, to sort of think through this idea of possibility and this idea of future when we pair it with this notion or gesture of decolonization. So to begin, I first want to start with this idea that the language with which we realize the world is a language of absolution, of a supposed knowing, and the imposition of itself tends to be violent. Edouard Glissant discusses this predicament in his book Caribbean Discourse and posits that a quote, imposed or forced poetics exists where a need for expression confronts an inability to achieve expression, and that this confrontation can happen when it is, quote, fixed in an opposition between the content to be expressed and the language suggested or imposed. A decolonial futurity is dimmed because of the very language imposed upon it. English is a language of violence. This discussion, borrowing from the poet Kaveh Akbar, explores the gestures of decolonization as a kind of, quote, neoliberal inoculation that positions the settler consciousness beyond and, quote, against one's own accountability. After all, decolonization is an English word. Glissant argues that our forced poetics will become worn out if it does not develop into a natural, free, open, cross-cultural poetics. And I borrow from this idea to propose the notion of an open poetics that exists in native texts and textures, and that these counter or protest aesthetics and poetics become a site of imposition and objection. In working toward a decolonial futurity, one must first upset the very inoculation that can exist in various neoliberal approaches to native texts. And to begin, I think we must first understand the ways decolonization has been defined. Linda Tehuai Smith writes, decolonization must offer a language of possibility, a way out of colonialism. The writing of Maori and other indigenous people and of anti-post-colonial writers would suggest quite clearly that the language of possibility exists within our own alternative oppositional ways of knowing. Smith defines decolonization as rooting English as a settler technology in native and indigenous epistemology. The way out is through. The idea of any decolonial future is reliant on the practice of a kind of rhetorical sovereignty. Scott Richard Lyons writes, quote, sovereignty is the guiding story in our pursuit of self-determination, the general strategy by which we aim to best recover our losses from the ravages of colonization, our lands, our language, our culture, our self-respect. A rhetorical sovereignty, Lyons continues, is the pursuit of that self-determination. He writes, rhetorical sovereignty is the inherent right and ability of peoples to determine their own communicative needs and desires in this pursuit, to decide for themselves the goals, modes, styles, and languages of public discourse. Lyons argues that rhetorical sovereignty is an attempt to revive not our past, but our possibilities. Both Smith and Lyons here are attempting to determine a decolonization of the mind and not necessarily land back or other insurgent movements that demand all land be returned to the stewardship of native nations. And I think therein exists the first reframing possible in our language of possibility, undoing the binary structures that exist in English in the first place. Because English is so much a language of absolution, one cannot exist without the other. One must be superior and one inferior. In the case of what kind of decolonization to enact, one of mind or one of land, discussions debate within binary understandings. However, working toward a more open poetics, one should move beyond binary and even spectrum understandings of consciousness. All things can exist all at once. I think of Mark Rifkin's discussion of simultaneity that positions Native personhood as beyond time, as existing in the past, present, and future at the same time. Rifkin writes, asserting Indigenous peoples and peoples' presences in the present, as opposed to casting them as anachronisms, does not necessarily redress the violence perpetrated through the organization of history around the coordinates of settler occupation. The treatment of non-native temporalities as the baseline for marking native being in time. Instead, native temporality should exist non-linearly, where the past, present, and future are not fixed through settler orientations, but instead open to the interpretation of other ways of knowing and being. The net activist Ruth Benally notes, we learned how to live by taking care of the livestock. It is like a cornfield. There are many ways to prepare corn and use the pollen. The pollen is used by healers in the Dineh Blessing Way ceremony. So that we never lose the memory of a cornfield, we have a natural kinship that is woven into the land. It is how we walk on the land. That is why even when we are told no, we have to resist. We do not want to live any other way. Benally's statement illustrates the way Native temporal orientation is not solely contained to a linear one. Instead, Benally is arguing that a Dineh way of knowing, a Dineh way of being, is linked inextricably with the land and the nurturing of it in a kind of deep time or deep temporality where time is understood through landscape and memory becomes the way one travels through time. And here, I think, is another opportunity to reframe meaning through a language of possibility. Memory is so fixed to the past as a kind of recalling that our understanding of memory is also very linear. We remember past events. One of the linguistic roots for the word memory literally means to mourn. Memory postured so critically against the past as a removal of the present orients the person doing the remembering as not fully whole and needing something to acquire or gain. Acquisition, we know too well, is also another root of colonization. We remember things to inform our present and shape our future, but memory is positioned today as a settler device that urges we commemorate what is lost and what must be attained again. I think about things such as the American way of life, American family values, and American security as all the things we commemorate that somehow justifies the aggressive maneuvering of the American military. Memory, however, within Indigenous orientations is more an act of the self rather than an act of loss. In Scott Momaday writes, memory begins to qualify the imagination, to give it another formation, one that is particular to the self. Memory as imagination and not a recalling of the past is a way Native texts roots its epistemologies in the English language. But what are some ways Native texts become language of possibility and upset neoliberal approaches to decolonization? My answer is language, land, time, land, language. All make up a kind of spatial temporal matrix, one I frequently refer to as the memory field. And the memory field is one key component in working toward an open poetic. The teaching of Native texts should involve the very kind of overtures the texts themselves are making to Native and Indigenous orientations and ways of knowing. I call these overtures Native textures that inhabit and mold and warp and upset and skew and smooth and river through, on, above, below, and within Native texts themselves. One of the more prominent devices of Native text is the novel, or the American Indian novel. In the past, the texts were often approached with the same breadth of anthropology or ethnography. Most novels existed were by non-Native authors, and most Native imagery were presented through non-Native directors, and most Native arts and crafts were collected through the lens of non-Native traders and curators. So the novel as a device is one of the various textures that Native authors make as they reframe and refine and redefine what the novel can be in a language of possibilities. So in the first example, I want to talk a little bit about the poet and writer Billy Ray Belcourt, whose work transcends the borders between creative and academic writing. In discussing his debut novel, A Minor Chorus, Belcourt notes, there's a sociological way that Indigenous literature is taken up by the general reading public that suggests that we are incapable of imagination, that certain creative powers aren't available to us. And I think that autofiction, surprisingly, can be one way to subvert that reading habit, because the blurring of reality in fiction is the point. That's how meaning is produced. It's the ongoing question of whether the book reflects out a lived life. I wanted the book to feel non-fictional partly because the lives represented aren't out of the ordinary. Northern Alberta, where most of the book takes place, is so overdetermined by history, such that everyone lives the historical life. Yet there's so little discourse or discussion about that. So I wanted to bring in almost journalistic or other ethnographic energy to the novel without, of course, reoccupying anthropological interests in Indigenous life, end quote. And A Minor Chorus does just that. It relies on a voice and narrator that has very close proximity with the reader, as illustrated in this short excerpt from the novel that reads, "For 10 seconds, I was already dead, then readied myself to die or to suffer gracefully, which is the captive's last survival tactic. I shut my eyes. I was the anti-hero of this tragedy. I felt as if he had reached through my chest and squeezed my heart. Miraculously, I squirmed out of his hole, then ran all the way home. For 20 minutes, not breathing or breathing one long breath, I couldn't tell which was which. I ran ahead of my body into bodilessness without my shoes on. Since then, I had always thought that if I were to write a book, I would write this down. So here, have it." Tommy Orange's There is also another kind of texture that frames the reading of the novel through its prologue. The narrator is close to the reader, guiding the reader through the various stories they're about to consume. Without the prologue, the book would read quite differently. However, Orange, knowing he was working within a forced poetics, arranged a book around the prologue, its textures, to create a chorus of voices that made up its possibilities. The novel is not one story, but many stories. It is both autofiction and memory as an imagination, and orients its reality not just against what is lost, but what can be found. In the prologue of there's a depiction of what's called the Indian head or the Indian head test pattern that really guides this sort of notion of novel. And of course, the chorus of voices is not a new model within the American Indian novel. Leslie Silko's Almanac of the Dead is an epic journey among various characters that travels literal time and space. Readers travel between the Southwest, South America, and Africa, between the past and present. The memory field links the sections called books together. Temporality is never linear. Landscape is character, and language attempts to reframe at every opportunity the way we understand the world. For example, the novel opens up with a map that sort of centers around Tucson as almost a center of the world. And the readers that then are forced to reframe in their minds the idea of a contemporary or modern world that exists within this notion of colonization. And of course, the novel itself is just one example of the way native textures reorient readers to the gestures of decolonization and futurity. The similarity between Belcourt, Orange, and Silko is the approach to form. We can also discuss form as a native texture, and it is one that can lead us into various genres because the form of native textures is one without border, much like native orientation and ways of knowing. Nothing is contained, everything is revered. Meaning happens at first light, first breath, first motion of hand, first word. For example, in Danielle Geller's memoir, Dog Flowers, Geller's history as an archivist allows Geller to reframe the narrative as a kind of temporal and spatial experience. Geller inherits a suitcase of her mother's belongings after her mother's death due to alcohol withdrawal. Geller then journeys through the belongings as if creating an archive. Each item is labeled and cared for as if artifact. And it's through this form that Geller is able to present the world a memory that is not solely rooted in its past, but rooted in its imagination, an imagination of the self, an imagination of the future. And here on the screen, we have some scanned images from Dog Flowers by Geller that shows portraits and objects that Geller found. And Geller went through and actually titled, dated, and described each particular item. And these particular images and objects sort of are sprinkled throughout the memoir. And here's another. And what those particular objects do is really create a kind of contextual timeline that is not linear, that really informs the narrative and reading of the memoir itself. Bad Indians by Deborah Miranda and Whereas by Lily Long Soldier also represent a kind of imagination of the future, despite despite venturing into complicated and entangled histories of Native people. Rather than focusing on historical life that is predetermined or overdetermined, as Belcourt posits, Geller, Miranda, and Long Soldier venture into a future possibility where their personhoods and the communities around them are surrounded by a kind of hope implied through the textures they create in their work. Their use of devices beyond written text help contextualize and textualize the histories and futures present in their work. And here on the screen, we have an example from Bad Indians by Deborah Miranda. You can see that there's sort of an assignment or a coloring book that Deborah Miranda is working with and is sort of beginning to create annotations within this coloring book that really highlights the sort of entanglement that colonial histories create, especially when you place them on this sort of linear timeline or this linear coordinates of settler occupation. In Now You Will Listen, an essay by Lady Longsoldier, Longsoldier meditates with form on the relationship of education and Native histories. The essay begins with forms, through a narrative of Longsoldier's experience attempting to educate her child's school about appropriate ways to discuss Native people. The essay then continues into what's called metamorphosis, as the essay begins to ponder the role of education and the discovery of 215 children's remains found at the Kamloops residential school in Canada. At the time, the news of grave sites in the United States had yet to be published. Longsoldier and her family then go through a process of grief and art making. And here is an excerpt from Now You Will Listen that reads, "Suddenly, my child and I together, all that of our feelings, what could we do but make? We began to move our hands. Why? I don't know. We began to braid. Why? It is a mystery, except we had to." Longsoldier in the essay ventures through form, genre, and medium as a way to reorient the reader around the grief and grieving. Our words were unnecessary, Longsoldier writes, as an affront to the very nature of reading, composition, and literary scholarship. We teach students to read and write, and not necessarily to witness and react, consume and produce, not necessarily forms and metamorphosis. What these Native textures illustrate is the self-determination of Native writers and authors to carve and curate the gaze of the reader toward futurity and possibility rather than the past and loss. So teaching Native texts and textures should involve elements of the future and not just a reclamation of the past, because they are not two different things, but the same things altogether. Teaching Native texts and textures should help readers react and witness form and metamorphosis, not just consume and produce. Teaching Native texts and textures should allow Native people to grieve quietly within their own space, and readers simply make space rather than find space within the text itself. This ideation can have many practical roots, but the baseline understanding here is to allow Native ways of knowing to provide the framework of readership and scholarship. This could mean undoing grading structures when involving Native text. It could mean asking questions that allow students to react and witness rather than traditional literary analysis. It should mean an emphasis is placed on form and the way Native textures are realized in the work. The question should be not of what the work is attempting to reclaim, but how is the work navigating us toward future and possibility? And to end this lecture and talk, and to get to some of your questions that you might have, I want to end this particular lecture, I guess you can call it, with a poem called Opening Light. Opening light. Gravity is God, deep felt, but impossible to see. What might be true? What joy? Two birds rigged to cloud, lake shimmer, wind kept in dust fog. There are monsters sometimes still deep inside people. opening light, thundering through. Say this is a step into silence toward beauty and everlasting. The air, the color of canyon peach, a rainlit morning in open field. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We do have plenty of time for discussion. If there any questions that anyone had, and that includes online too. We could open the chat function and type questions if you have any. Can we see? Anyone? Oh, perfect.
Well, I've been talking all morning, so I need to continue. So the three works that you selected, okay, could I ask you what you thought the unifying factor was? Why did you select those three?
That's a good question. And yeah, I did think about the kinds of texts I should incorporate in this talk to sort of provide an example of what I'm trying to get at, or at least what I'm thinking through. And the novels specifically, A Minor Chorus, again by Billy Ray Belcourt, They're There by Tommy Orange, and Almanac of the Dead by Leslie Marmon Silko. What they all do for me as a reader and in my analysis of them is really play around with the idea of the novel as a form. In A Minor Chorus, Billy Ray Belcourt has this very close proximity, or the narrator has a really close proximity with the audience. And it's a kind of auto-fiction that I think that sort of becomes a form of the novel, and that's really different than what we consider, right? The idea of like the third person traditional American style novel or the American novel, right? And They're There by Tommy Orange, the prologue, I think, is was a very interesting choice. I thought a really interesting intervention that Orange made, right? That sort of sets up and positions and really frames the entire novel, because we're not just reading stories, we're reading stories that involve a kind of real community, a real group of people, and those people have a kind of future. And I think the prologue sets that up really neatly for us as readers. And in Almanac of the Dead by Leslie Marmon Silko, the entire novel is, I wouldn't even call it a novel, it's more like an epic poem that sort of travels through various spaces, various timelines, and it's able to sort of really build an entirely different world that is sort of centered around Tucson, Arizona, centered around the Southwest, where Silko is from. And it's a really interesting practice of reorientation, right? Where if we look at a global map, the United States is somehow center, but in the world of Almanac of the Dead, it's no longer the center. Instead, we have places like Tucson in the Southwest, South America and Africa becoming central places. And I think the idea of decolonization then, right, is that reorientation. So the three novels there for me are really playing with form, and really upsetting this notion of what the novel can be. And I think that's what makes up this idea of native textures for those particular works.
Thank you. And we have plenty of time. It looks like we have a question online, so I'm going to go ahead and read this. As a historian, I found your discussion of the relationship between colonization and reclamation really helpful. And of course, historians tend to look back, but how might we incorporate this notion of looking toward the future into our classes, grading, assignments, even as we study what came before?
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a great question. And it would involve really thinking through what assessment means, especially when you get to the teaching of native texts, right? As an educator myself, I began at Diné College, which is a tribal college on the Navajo Nation, one of the first tribally controlled colleges in the United States. And there was a very interesting, I want to say, balance between indigenous-centered education and the sort of Western assessment model that colleges, specifically community colleges, have to follow. So things like accreditation was a big topic at the school. And we sort of went back and forth between, do we teach how we want to teach as Diné people to our own communities, or do we prescribe and are forced to sort of move into this idea of a forced poetic, right, of accreditation models? So the debate went back and forth and back and forth. And one of the things that, or one of the key words or buzzwords that are constantly tossed around was the idea of grading and assessment. How do we grade student work? How do we assess student work? How do we make sure that they're reaching student learning outcomes? And one of the fundamental notions, and basically what unified us as faculty, was the notion that you can't teach the work we're teaching, like native texts and Diné literature, and confine it to the notion of assessment models and the traditional sort of student learning outcomes and course learning outcomes. So I think one of the ways that we as educators and sort of people at the head of the classroom can think really deeply about is, how do we really interrogate and scrutinize the kinds of grading structures and outcomes we are prescribing to our students, especially in relationship to native texts and native experiences, right? Because on one hand, we want to be sure that we're teaching our students fundamental themes about personhood and community and nation building. But on the other, we don't want to manufacture a kind of production line, right? Where we just have students consuming and producing and consuming and producing, right? So it's a very small balance. And I think one of the ways that you might incorporate the idea of looking toward the future is really looking at that grading structure, right? Because as students are often coming to our classrooms worried about grades, worried about their futures, right? And one of the ways that we can alleviate that anxiety is think more deeply about, okay, well, the grading structure is going to look differently for this section when we're involving Native people, right? And I think that's one of the ways that I'm really thinking through right now, especially in my creative writing classes here at the University of Oklahoma, is how do I grade poetry, right? How do I grade Native literature? Because there's not a way to adequately capture that very important problem. And I feel like it's one that we are continuing to work toward. But I like the idea of basing it, this idea in future, right? Futurity work, right? And I think, yes, as you know, the model of Western history, right, definitely sort of focused on the past, but I think there is a way to involve the present and involve the future in that work.
Thank you. We do have another question online asking what advice you have or action items for non-Native listeners, especially when it comes to decolonization of the mind, body, and the land.
Mm-hmm. Yes, for sure. And this is a question I get too often as well, as action items. Like, what are some tangible things we can do on the ground, especially what can non-Native people do that are tangible on the ground, right? And I just mentioned one, right? If you're an educator or someone at the head of a classroom, or you're a dean, or you're a higher education administrator, take a look at your assessment models, take a look at your outcomes, your matrices, your sort of matrices, your grading structures, right? I feel like you can look to those particular areas to really figure out how to alleviate some anxiety about the future, right, that our students are carrying with them into the classroom. When it comes to personal actionable items, I think the idea of reframing decolonization of the mind, body, and land as one entire thing, right, that are made up of composite parts, right? And I think it's just learning how to think about English language with more intention, right? And being very particular about the words that we use. So for example, memory, right? I don't think memory is the right word for memory, because when I was researching the sort of roots of memory, I kept coming across words like anxiety, words like mourn, words like loss, right? But when I think about memory, from my perspective, those are things I don't consider. Those are things I don't think about. Instead, memory for me is about experience. Memory is life, is living a full life, right? Memory is kind of knowledge being realized um, in sort of a collapsed time frame. But of course, in English, there might not be a word for what I'm trying to get at, right? And that's when we can venture out into other forms of thinking about coding the reality that we currently live in. So I think one of the actionable items we can is really thinking about language with intention, that English itself has always been a settler device, a settler technology, right? Um, and that its very nature as a language, as a communicative device and vehicle, has always been trade and capitalism, right? And so we need to be sure that we're thinking through the language we use very carefully. And that's just, and I think what you can do to sort of undo some of those processes is, read more and write more, specifically read and write more from an orientation that feels more personable to you from your particular histories, right? And I think that's one of the other actionable items I can talk about in terms of what we can do and what we can consider as we sort of move into the world and out into our communities.
Thank you so much. Do we have other questions in the audience who are in attendance? Excellent.
So I don't really quite know how to word this as a question exactly, more as just an observation. So I'm a student in Dr. Mauser's medievalisms class, and we just discussed an article on Tolkien, which heavily discussed his intersectionality between his scholarly and his creative work, and how he uses his scholarship in the creative to perpetuate a lot of these harmful stereotypes and ideals of the medieval. And I know you mentioned, I think in your discussion of the first novel, I was curious how you noticed, since it is a white author, I'm curious how you noticed them perpetuating things that is really harmful to Indigenous people, as well as how we as white people and white educated scholars to use creative work not in a harmful way. Because I think even without intending to, it's so easy, just because of the indoctrination that we've all received in our society. It's so easy just to perpetuate really harmful things. And I'm curious, just within the Indigenous studies, since I'm only familiar with the medieval at the moment, how you saw that portrayed.
I think I understand the question. First what I want to talk about briefly is just how do we move into our work without the notion of it potentially being harmful. And I think one of the things that we have to realize and consider is that, because yes, we are so indoctrinated, we might end up having the capacity to harm, even though we're not necessarily intending. So with that capacity there, right, I think it allows us, and it actually frees us to really think more deeply about, again, the language we use, the words that we use, right? And of course, the kind of intention we have. Recently on Twitter, there was and of course, everywhere on Twitter is the debate, but I saw recently on Twitter, there was an educator who had assigned an assignment to their students about the Carlisle Indian School, right? And the educator had their students sort of go through and read through narratives by the students that were at the Carlisle Indian School, and then sort of come back to class with some of the reactions and talk about, you know, what they read, what they learned as an assignment, right? And of course the debate launched from it. People were saying that it was an okay assignment. Other people saying no, that this is actually a very harmful assignment. I couldn't take a side on that particular. I couldn't take a position because I was trying to think more deeply about what was happening, what the educator was intending, right? And I think the intention of the educator wasn't necessarily to harm, but because there was this intention of it being an assignment, right? I think that is where the sort of the capacity comes more present, right? More prevalent. Because when we assign something, right? Again, there's the manufacturing of this production line almost, right? So I think we have to be very careful about what assignment means for our students, what that could entail, right? And it's all about and I think it's all about reframing some of those things. So being really honest in dialogue with intention, with assessment specifically, and grading, I think will help sort of alleviate some of that capacity for harm. And in terms of the novels particularly, I think what A Minor Chorus and They're There and Almanac of the Dead are doing, again, are really framing the way the reader should read the novel, and really sort of setting up structures and frameworks for that. And A Minor Chorus, again, it's the autofiction element. It's the narrator being very close to and even sometimes addressing the reader. And They're There, it's the prologue. It's sort of setting up this sort of notion of what does it mean to be an urban native or an urban Indian, right? And Leslie Stokoe's Almanac of the Dead, right? There's that little map, right? There's the mapping of space and time. And I feel like Stokoe takes such good care of the reader as we travel through all these books and all these places and all these timelines. And those are the types of interventions, those types of textures, I think, are some probably overlooked often, right? They're not considered when you're teaching, you know, in a native lit class or native lit segment, those particular elements. You might be talking more about, colonization and decolonization, right? But not necessarily those sort of craft elements that might exist that warrant deeper investigation into the particular book. And all of those textures and interventions and craft elements are geared toward a kind of futurity that the authors are trying to get at, I think. And that can often be overlooked or not necessarily talked about in favor of other more digestible elements like trauma and grief and things of that nature. I hope that makes sense.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And as someone who studies oral tradition myself, I like the idea of thinking about ways of reading instead of just the traditional literary approaches to things. But I do notice we're pretty much out of time. And so I did want to thank you again for joining us today and see if you had any final words for us before we moved on to our 1 o'clock sessions.
No, just thank you. I'm definitely honored to be here again. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for your great questions. Again, I'm just super excited about this work. And of course, it's still a work in progress as well. So I'll definitely take all your questions in mind and think about how I can more fully realize some of the ideas I'm thinking through. So thank you so much.
Thank you too. Thank you. And for everyone who's joining us in the room, I do want to mention that we will have our 1 o'clock sessions, a 1 o'clock session with me in room 356 on standard grammar and its colonizing roots. And in 343, we have a discussion with one of our KCU professors, Jennifer Dennis. In the meantime, there is coffee and water, and then after the 2 o'clock session, hopefully cookies and fruit will appear, as well as fresh coffee. And in the meantime, feel free to still enter for the raffle to win the quilts. There are tickets for sale out front, as well as our blind date the book, where we had several authors who contributed their works signed for us. And we wrote little teasers about what may be in that particular package. So thank you all for being here.